All right, sweet, fantastic. Okay, so my name's Ben. Lovely to meet everybody. So as Nefes mentioned, my kind of speciality, where I kind of land in the ecosystems, in this kind of weird middle of a Venn diagram between business analysis, strategy, writing, design, public speaking, fundraising. It's this kind of this hybrid kind of middle ground of all those different things. And where that has kind of left me is doing pitches and presentations, specifically for tech companies raising money at a kind of a seed, sometimes pre-seed, depends. But a seed and a Series A level is kind of where that's my ballpark, where I generally play. And so I'll start off just kind of giving a little bit of a background of kind of like how I arrived at this point and what the basis of it is. So I actually did not come from an MBA background, did not come from a traditional kind of business background. As I mentioned, my professional training is as a designer, but where I found a lot of the insights in terms of working in the tech ecosystem is from the music industry. So I used to do stuff on stage like this and off stage like this, around a production company, doing a ton of promotion, design, organizing things, having to pitch bands and festivals and labels versus tech companies and accelerators. And when I moved into the tech scene here in Toronto in 2013 from Iceland, where I mostly grew up, saw tons of parallels and just kind of dove straight in. Went to grad school at OCAD, not a fan of it, but it was an interesting experience. After that, went on to work in an agency doing stuff like Nike, Coca-Cola, the NFL, Samsung, the whole laundry list of Fortune 500 companies. Now engaged with, as Nefes mentioned, the DMZ as an entrepreneur in residence there, specifically for the purposes of fundraising and pitching and storytelling. And I also work with, do the same thing more or less at YSpace as well, and very much involved with Founder Institute, which is a pre-seed and kind of idea stage accelerator, taking on very early stage founders just at the beginning of their journey and kind of moving on into the ecosystem. So I see a lot of founders at the beginning of their journey through Founder Institute, see them in the middle of their journey, kind of with YSpace and DMZ, and then in my more professional work and my kind of Series A clients, I see them kind of up at that upper level. If you need my help at a Series B, you've got bigger problems. So we're actually recruiting for the next cohort of Founder Institute, which deadline is on Sunday. So if anybody wants more info on that, they're welcome to reach out. Fairly early stage, so YSpace is a bit more advanced maybe, but that is going on at the moment. That brings me to Pitchbook, which is my presentation and pitch deck design and writing service. So that, in summary, kind of puts me on in the middle of a spectrum, kind of somewhere between Don Draper from Mad Men and Jared from Silicon Valley. So I kind of sit somewhere in the middle there, right? So what are we talking about, right? We're talking about this arrangement, or this game of us trying to tell stories about our companies to engender some kind of an action or reaction from our audience. So there's a lot of kind of schools of thought that fly around pitching, and you've got methods like Guy Kawasaki's method, and you've got these like 3-point methods and 3 slides, or these very rigid structures. Not generally a fan of such rigid kind of frameworks and structures. So I like to break it down as kind of a game, right? So it's a lot easier to understand what we're really doing here. So the objectives of this game are, there's always 2 players, right? On the one hand, there's you. Your objective as a founder or somebody who's presenting is to deliver a message that persuades your audience to take action. And now on the other side of the table, as you're delivering that message, your audience, their objective is to assess whether the idea being presented, what you're presenting, is worth their resources. Those resources can be time, attention, money, connections, opening doors, all kinds of things that those resources can actually be. But generally, they're making a risk assessment, right? It's an immediate knee-jerk reaction risk assessment. Do I continue to pay attention? Do I engage with this founder? Do I sign a check? Do I pass this on to an LP? Do I get a second look? Do I get a second meeting? That it's a risk assessment, right? And so, those being the objectives, let's look at who the players are, what the pieces are, what the rules are, and kind of what the prizes are that we're after. So the players generally, it's investors, accelerators, customers, potential customers, partners, team members. These are the kinds of people that you're going to be presenting to generally as a startup. We can add the general public in there as well, but they will also fall into one of these 5 categories. Maybe they're customers, maybe they're partners, maybe they're potential team members. When you're presenting to a large room of people, you never really know who's going to be there. So it's always good, whatever the room size, put your best foot forward, and because you never know who is there and what kind of connection you can get, right? Now, the pieces that you have to kind of play to play the game. So on the one hand, your message. So the message can be one of a couple of things. It's your kind of 5-second, extremely quick. Like, what do you do? In my case, I do PowerPoints for startups. Like, that is my 2-word, 3-word sentence, because it doesn't describe the sum total of the company or what it is that I do, but it describes enough to start a conversation and get that risk. And it's very low risk. It's very low attention. It's just, what do you do? I do this. There's a high likelihood that whoever I'm talking to in a certain space needs that service or has some kind of interest in that or has a follow-up question, right? So there are your short versions of that message, and then it just kind of ramps up after that, right? You've got your 5 to 10 second, what we would generally call your kind of elevator pitch or a tagline. You've got your 1 to 3 minute version. You've got a 5-minute version, a 10-minute version. Past 10 minutes, you start to generally kind of waffle on, and it's not really necessarily not of any benefit necessarily, because the vast majority of what you need to get across, you can generally get across in 10 minutes. If any of you have seen TED Talks, there's a ton of information that you can get across in 4 minutes, 5 minutes, right? You just got to refine it, and you've got to be focused and conversational. We'll cover all that in due time. So that's your message, and a good message is the basis of any a good message is the basis of any deck. And so once you actually have a message put together, then you have your deck, which is really just a document that you use to present. So it's a series of slides that you either have up on a screen or something that you send ahead, and your landing page, right? So these are very basic, extremely basic pieces, but these are the elements that you use. You can innovate a little bit around this with doing maybe like a 1-page PDF and sending that along, or maybe a flyer or whatever, but generally the message is the basis of these documents. And a landing page is really just to capture attention after the fact, right? So after you've presented and you're trying to funnel people towards a certain some kind of outcome or some kind of offering, a landing page is what you would use to send people that way. This is, they seem obvious to a lot of you, but what we're really doing here is just setting the framework and setting the parameters for what it is that we're doing. Because one of the things you notice a lot, especially with very early stage founders, is there's a lot of inclinations to try and innovate on the model and do things differently, not necessarily of a benefit, because you're doing things outside of what is generally understood and generally kind of an intuitive engagement with an audience member that recognizes these pieces. So let's not mess with this until once you've perfected your message and perfected your deck and perfected the landing page, sure, we can innovate past that. But really what we're here for are fundamentals, right? So what are the rules? Generally, pitching circumstances, we're talking 3 to 11 minutes. 3 minutes in a pitch competition, 11 minutes if you have if you're 11 to 12, maybe 15 minutes if you're presenting to a small room of angels. Approximately 15 slides. I'm not particularly hung up on the number of slides. I don't really think it matters. My deck is dozens and dozens of slides. I think this one is 83 slides, but it isn't necessarily any more difficult to digest than a longer deck or a smaller deck, or any easier, or a shorter deck wouldn't necessarily be easier. It's really about the amount of content, the complexity of the content, and at what kind of a pace you get through that content. This is effectively 3 slides, right? It's just a little trick to kind of lead you through a section. Let's not get hung up on the particulars of what's actually going on. And what the format actually is. Let's think more about how are we communicating? Are we being conversational? Are we segueing? Are we moving at a decent pace through our story? And are we actually getting some traction and some connection with our audience, right? So touching on all key points, we're going to cover the actual structure in a second. There's a range of things that people expect to see in a pitch deck. They expect to see you articulate your problem. They expect to see you articulate your solution, talk about your team, whether you can do it. Basically, these structures and these key points are answering a couple of basic questions. What is it that you're doing? How is it that you're doing it? Are you capable of doing it? And can you, and sorry, it's the WAC method. The name of the author that came up with it escapes me, but I'll look it up as soon as we get into Q&A. But it's WHAC. So what is it? What is it that you're doing? How does it work? Are you sure? Can you pull it off? So what is the product? What is the problem that you're solving? What is the solution? How does it work? So let me see under the hood a little bit and understand how it functions. Are you sure that it functions that way? Back it up with a bit of data and some roadmaps and some proof, because you can't really build a company on an assumption. You need some empirical evidence that what you are doing does at least have a chance of working. And then can you pull it off? Do you have the roadmap? Do you have the team? Do you have the technical capabilities to actually do it? And if you lose your audience, you lose the game, because if people stop paying attention, doesn't matter what you're saying, does not matter how incredible your company is. If someone's not paying attention, they're not in the room. So, well, for each of these points, we're going to cover kind of very specific tactics and strategies throughout the rest of the workshop. But this is just setting the stage for what it is that we're generally doing. Because ultimately, the prize that we're after, it could be an investment or a spot in an accelerator like YSpace, or a potential new team member, potential partnership, or a potential customer. But ultimately, the top thing that we are really after is another interaction. We don't necessarily have to kind of go for a single knockout punch right off the bat. What we're trying to do is build enough interest so that whoever we are talking to, whoever we are trying to convince of that risk assessment, to make a favorable risk assessment, that we get another interaction with them. So your elevator pitch is supposed to lead to your elevator pitch should lead to a chat. That chat should lead to sending in a document. That document should lead to an invite to pitch. That pitch will lead to an invite to pitch to more partners or LPs or whoever, and more people within either an organization or whether that's investors or an accelerator, you're pitching more and more people. So it's a chain of interactions, right? There is no mega, some incredible Steve Jobs style pitch that's just absolutely going to get checks flying your way. It doesn't really work like that. It's always going to be a chain of interactions, and you will be constantly pitching and constantly communicating about your business throughout the lifespan of the company. You're always going to be fundraising, always going to be communicating, whether it's internally or externally. Same principles apply. You're always trying to go for another interaction as you're building. Now, big elephant in the room, obviously, things have changed a bit. I don't know if you've noticed, but we're living in a bit of a different world at the moment. Now, one of the things that has become quite apparent, though, is that certain things have changed a lot, but certain things have not changed at all. And certain things have been kind of put into stark relief and very kind of high contrast, in that companies still need to communicate properly. They still need to have a credible way forward in what they're doing. They still need to show that they understand their market and their problems, and that their solution is novel and interesting and well put together and has some chance of getting off the ground. The uncertainties at the moment are largely around fundraising, what the state of markets is going to be in the future. Certain sectors are obviously worse hit than others. Personally, the past kind of 2 months of my time have been spent either dealing with founders who are struggling quite severely with their companies due to their clients being essentially shut down by lockdowns and travel restrictions and a variety of COVID-related limitations and difficulties. And then there's the other camp of people that are just blowing up, and they're doing extremely well because their business happened to align with something that has become a very acute need right now. So I think Nefis, if I'm correct, you have, I think Russ is coming in. Russ Armstrong to have a chat about raising funds in a crisis, or raising funds at the moment. I think that's coming up in the next couple of days. Pay close attention to that. Pay close attention to what's going on there, because it'll, large funds are still around, and they can weather recessions like this. Great companies are built in recessions. So it is a difficult time, but world isn't entirely ending, and we can definitely find ways forward for most companies. It might mean a pivot. It might mean that we have to kind of adjust ways of operating and adjust the focus of the company, but it's not the end of the world. Okay, so let's start digging into some of these specific materials. Right? So a deck. Deck is one of two. Your deck is going to serve kind of one of two functions. So they're going to be a series of slides that supports the live presentation. That's what I'm doing right now. I have some text on screen, but I'm delivering the vast majority of my story, my narrative, verbally. Right? Or it can also be a document that communicates your message in your absence. What tends to happen is that the founders will try and use the same deck for both situations. The former has a lot less detail in it because I'm delivering that detail verbally. The latter has to be able to provide some of that detail without me being there. So it doesn't mean that you get to just write like a gigantic kind of magazine article style deck, but you do have to add a little bit more information so that the deck is understandable. So that the deck is understandable in isolation without you being in the room. So those are two discrete types of decks, right? Now, crafting your message. So the vast majority of my time, even though my service usually gets billed as usually gets kind of presented as a design service, design is actually maybe 15 to 20% of the actual time that goes into producing decks. The vast majority of the time goes into writing. And what we're doing in that writing process is that we're picking apart what is actually going on within a company. What is actually going on within a company? What are the true strengths and weaknesses of the company? How do we speak to those strengths and weaknesses? And how do we adjust that messaging for different audiences and make it nice and conversational, so that it isn't just like reading off a checklist of achievements and features and capabilities and buzzwords. It's when people say story, what they're really talking about is just a conversational explanation of what they're doing. We have our story structure. We have a kind of a general story structure, which is your problem, solution, market, team, those types of structures. But really, what a good story is a conversational, simple, one-on-one, human to human explanation of what it is that you're doing. So, writing a long, chunky script is not going to necessarily help you get all that information across. Filling it with buzzwords and hyper condensing it down to very specific industry terms just to make it short, that is not helping you either. It needs to be conversational. You need to be able to just explain it to somebody in a basic way. And we'll get into how specifically you can do that. But initially, you do need to start with just blurting out kind of a preliminary script. Think of it as creating a cheat sheet, but you don't take the cheat sheet to the meeting. Because what's going to happen if you write out a full word-for-word script is that you're going to try and remember the script, but you ultimately can't remember that amount of text. You're going to stumble. You're going to have to backtrack and go forward, and it's going to be jerky and difficult. And just the effort of trying to deliver a memorized block of text is a lot harder than just knowing your company and explaining it at a kind of a basic in basic language at a conversational pace. So a focused and validated idea being the bedrock of a good pitch. Where we see kind of story, what we would otherwise call storytelling, and these narratives go a bit haywire, is when you have founders with, say, shiny object syndrome. So it's like, ooh, we do, we're a fintech startup, but we also do insurance, but we also do real estate listing, and we also do cleaning services, and we also do a car rental because we have a garage. And so it starts to diffuse out into all these different angles and just going down all these different paths and different rabbit holes. If you send people off in multiple different directions, you're never going to finish a single journey. Like, you can't take someone along if you're sending them in all kinds of different directions all the time. That's why we want to commit to a specific message. And this is something that is an operational point for a company, deciding on specifically what your product is, specifically who it is that you're selling it to, what are the issues that you're solving, how is it generally that you're solving it, and just addressing each of those points in kind of a logical progression. So luckily, in the format that we're playing with in startup world, we have structures that are well recognized, that are generally that are well recognized and generally accepted, right? So we actually have an advantage in that respect. We don't have to invent or reinvent the wheel every time we go into structure. And so once we have a structure like that in place, filling it out with information, we do want to make sure that a lot of it is fact-based and not assumptions-based, as little as possible assumptions-based, and that the information being presented raises as few red flags as possible. As an example, one of the main ones that we tend to see kind of eyebrows raise a bit and kind of cynicism kick off and knee-jerk reactions kick up is our market sizing, right? Bringing in all kinds of different numbers, say like, oh, this is a bazillion $trillion market. And when you actually dig into the numbers, there may be, they're pulling in all kinds of disparate numbers that don't necessarily fit with the company's actual offering, with the company's actual market. Often it's the company's client's market or kind of an expanded market that doesn't really make sense for them. But it's put in there for the purposes of, oh, but we need a big market size. Well, you can't fudge those numbers, because what's going to happen is that if you put in an over-exaggerated number on a market slide, gradually you get down the line, you get into actually having conversations with investors and having conversations with potential partners or team members, and these numbers start to matter, or it doesn't necessarily have to be market size. This is a bunch of different types of information, but just as an example, for sake of argument, once it comes out that those numbers are not entirely correct, you're just setting yourself up for a bit of an obstacle, a bit of a red flag down the line, which nobody wants to be told a lot later that what they thought was going to be a great opportunity is actually 1/10 or 1/100th the size of the opportunity. And if the market size doesn't align to what you're doing, you can't just pull in new numbers and change the market size. You have to examine what it is that the company is really, like, who it is that the company is really going after. Have you found your ideal customer? Is the market that you're looking at really the market that you're looking at? These are all things that founders can kind of figure out on their own in isolation, but more often than not, they will do so with the help of advisors, with their peers, team members, entrepreneurs in residence, like myself or others at an accelerator. But generally, it's imperative that you can back up the numbers, that you can back up whatever numbers, whatever information is in the deck when it comes around. Now, avoiding repetition there's a school of thought wherein there's this idea that you have to constantly repeat what your value proposition is to make it stick. What I found is that isn't necessarily it's not necessarily the best use of your time in a very short 3-minute pitch. If you have a 10-15-minute pitch, sure, you can kind of come back and reiterate some points, because the length of the presentation is long enough that your audience's memory may start to slip, or they need to be reminded of certain aspects, or reiterate certain aspects of a business when in different sections. But generally, if you have 3 minutes, you've got a 180-second budget. So you have a 180-second time budget. If you are reiterating the same points again and again, you're re-spending those 5 seconds, those 10 seconds. They add up very quickly, right? I mean, I make a point, so it says about transitions. Like, if you have a fade or you have some kind of a transition, it takes maybe half a second. If you've got 30 slides, that's 15 seconds. So now you have a 165 or 170 second time budget. So it's these small refinements that do add up in those short ones. And one of the refinements we can most often make is to cut down on repetition and make sure that when we are making points, that they are made clearly, concisely, as part of a flow that the audience is kind of engaged with and can either relate to or could absorb, versus having to kind of just batter them again and again and again with the same piece of information. Last point on this one in terms of crafting a message is knowing your audience, right? So a room of, say, early stage founders like here may have a different set of interests to the general public. Let's say like a large event like Elevate, for instance, or a room of angel investors or VCs or say admins in an accelerator that are evaluating a company. There's always going to be a different slant to what it is exactly that those different audiences are after. General public, more about ideas, more about the general idea and the kind of the nice warm fuzzy vision and the mission and kind of what it is that we're doing and how incredible this company is and whatnot. Investors maybe a little, slanted maybe a little bit more towards the financial side and viability of the company. If you're trying to onboard tech talent, slants maybe a bit more towards the technical, right? So presenting to a room full of engineering students that are looking for job placement for the summer. These different audiences, and you can generally identify maybe 3 to 4 up to 5 audiences that you can adjust messaging for. And in doing so, you are radically upping your chances of connecting with that audience because you're speaking in their terms, in their space, in their language. And to kind of figure out that structure and that story structure, this is a general structure that I tend to follow. It is not the be-all end-all of structures for decks. It does not have to be precisely in this order, and there are plenty of other structures that you can take a look at. My general piece of advice is that it doesn't matter necessarily which structure you use. It just matters that you use a structure, that there is a logical progression through the deck, and that there are identifiable sections where you say, oh, could you go back to the problem slide? No, the other problem slide. No, the other one. No, the one at the end. Okay, like you don't want to have to jump around. You don't want to have to jump around in your story, because then you start to get this diffuse attention instead of just everybody going on the same journey together in the same kind of narrative flow that you lead the audience through. You're sending them off in all these different directions, right? Now, the one slight edit to this is that most of the companies that I'm working with now have had to add their COVID slide. So here what we're talking about really is what is going on with the company in terms of its vulnerability to COVID and the current situation. Generally what's happening is that we're seeing larger raises for longer runways because the uncertainty has kind of spiked a little bit. And the uncertainty has spiked quite a lot in terms of what the future looks like, what market sizes look like. Can founders keep their teams on board? Are they going to be able to continue paying them? Are their customers going to continue buying? There's just so much uncertainty that there's a need now to kind of address how have you thought about your company in the context of the pandemic and kind of what is going on? How do you survive it? Are you going to survive? Are you going to thrive? What do you need to do to adapt? It's just another point that we need to address, but we'll go back to the standard structure for the time being. And what we're looking at here really is a list and a route through most of the key points, as we mentioned before. You want to cover all your key points. What the key points are about the business that you need to get across so that you can make a risk assessment as an audience member. All right. It's your cover page, overview, problem, market, solution, revenue, traction, competition, advantage, roadmap, team, ask, and thank you. Now, what the real underlying story here is cover page. This is who we are, overview. Here's what we're generally doing. here's the world that we are generally living in. This is the problem that exists in that world that we're going after. That problem is worth this amount of money if we are able to actually solve it. Here's the solution we've come up with to solve it, and here's how we make money to do that so that we can continue solving it into the future. We've done this much so far, and there are other players in the market that are doing these things. We are better than them because of the following points. Our roadmap and our plan to continue to be better than them is this. The people that are pushing the company down that road and down that journey are these people, and these are the credentials and why they are able to do it. Here is what we need from you to continue doing that, ideally. And then a thank you for your time is a little bit of a hack where you have a final slide, show a little bit of the product, a couple of bullet points on what it is that the company does, because more likely than not, that slide is going to sit there for the longest time out of any slide in your deck. Because if that slide is up there during Q&A, it means that slide is there for 3 to 4 minutes, right? So if you have a nice little summary at the end, there, you can hack a bit of attention. And as Q&A is going on, your audience can focus their attention on your product and ideally some contact info or a link to a landing page. That's where you start to pull them in, right? So there is it is a fairly rigid, rudimentary structure, but we can shake this up a bit. So for instance, let's say you're doing a very heavy technical project, something AI related or something kind of deep tech related. Lots and lots of cynicism around AI, lots of cynicism around everything blockchain, everything crypto. There's plenty of memes and jokes around that, and with good reason. Let's say we're talking about an AI company. Well, at the very beginning, we established credibility as or a PhD in natural language processing and some specifics that establish your credibility so that you can neutralize the cynicism that comes up. Because otherwise, what's going to happen as soon as you start talking about AI and start throwing some of these buzzwords around, the cynicism level is going to start rising. It's like, well, yeah, I hear a lot about AI stuff, and I'm not exactly sure what's going on here. Don't quite trust these people until the very end. Oh, okay, they're super qualified experts with incredible credentials, an amazing panel of advisors, and they've actually done this 4 or 5 times before over the past decade. That is something in that case that we want to neutralize that cynicism right from the get-go. Another example of that, for instance, would be say you're doing anything related to e-commerce or transit. The question, the Amazon question or the Uber question is always going to come up. It's going to be, what about Uber? What about Uber? What about Uber? That is going to be playing on a loop in the audience's mind until you directly address it. Same with Amazon. If you're doing something e-commerce related, it's always going to be this, rational or not, doesn't really matter. We're not necessarily dealing with rational reactions here. We're dealing with we're not necessarily dealing with rational reactions. We're dealing with these knee-jerk reactions, emotional reactions, subconscious reactions. So neutralizing that question of what about Amazon, what about Uber, what about your capabilities to pull off an AI project early on, will calm those concerns and allow people to kind of move on in their own critical thinking and their own risk assessment of the companies. Oh, okay, they've got that figured out. Great, cool. Well, let's listen to some of the other stuff. I'm going to pause here for a second and maybe take a couple of questions.
Yeah, Ben,
popping up
quite a few on the chat.
Absolutely. While I take a sip here, do you want to read out maybe
for sure.
1 or 2 questions?
So Michelle was asking, how can you add subtitles and presentations that are high quality but cheap?
Right, subtitles to presentations. Just to clarify, are you thinking in terms of if you are going to say like record like a canned video pitch and add subtitles to that? Inclusivity and accessible. Maybe. Okay, right. Oh. So on the cheap, so I actually think, let's see, there is a, let's see if this works.
Yep.
Okay, it seems to be working. So there is actually a subtitle function within PowerPoint that allows you to just add subtitles on the fly. So I've never actually used it, so I can't necessarily recommend it. But I mean, look, anecdotally, let's try leaving this on and see if it works. It's kind of an interesting approach. We may get some very memeable content if we get some funny autocorrects, but that's a new one, Michelle. I hadn't had to address that one before. But good point. Now, let's say we don't have this option. It's always a sliding scale in terms of production values for any pitch. There's always a sliding scale of time and resources. So if you have money, you can use rev.com. You can record yourself speaking, send your recording to something like rev.com. It's ref.com to get a transcript of what you're doing, and then just add that to a webinar after the fact. Doing it live, I mean, so let's see. I don't know if you see my camera, a little sneak peek of my apartment as well, but there's a button just there, right here in my kind of presenter view, that is just subtitles. So I hit that and it starts subtitling for me. I'm presuming this is some form of like natural language processing, that it's just listening to my voice and doing it on the fly. That's a new one, but an interesting one. Yes, so I'm not sure how you do that live outside of that, but if you can record a pitch ahead of time and add them yourself, that's just your, if you have the time to do it yourself. It's cheap. If you don't have the time to do it, but you have resources, then pay a freelancer or somebody, obviously Fiverr or a freelance platform like that to do it.
On that topic, Ben, I know Zoom also has a closed caption option. So if you're doing a webinar, you can set that on, and you could also assign people to do that as well. Absolutely.
I saw another question here is like, what platform do you suggest using? I cover this point later on, but I can jump to it now. I use PowerPoint for 99% of everything because it's an incredibly capable tool, and you really don't need anything other than PowerPoint. In a pinch, if you do not have access to PowerPoint, then Google Slides is a very cheap option. Now, excuse me, the one platform I would unilaterally just advise against using is Keynote, because it does not play nice with any other platforms, including Keynote. So older versions of Keynote, we've had a situation where we had a Keynote file that was created on a Mac that had an older operating system on it. Sorry, it was created on a Mac that has a newer operating system on it, or one of the newer versions. We tried to open it on one that had an older version of Mac OS, and it tried to force the user to upgrade the operating system so that it would open Keynote. And it garbles and scrambles PowerPoint files. It garbles and scrambles PDFs, and there is no effective way of downloading slides docs into Keynote, other than just downloading it as a .key. But it's such a liability that I've just stayed away from Keynote entirely. Again, I use PowerPoint, but really it does not matter what you use to create the presentation. What matters is that you save it as a PDF. You can, if you have a PDF on a stick, there's projectors that you can stick that you can stick that USB key into, and it will play a PDF. Won't necessarily play PowerPoint or a Keynote file or whatever else, but there are so many different devices that universally play PDFs that is always your safe go-to. It's why I don't use any animation in presentations I do. It's why I don't include video and audio in decks that I do. It's because we have them as the ability to save them as PDFs is crucial, because it means that the way you save it is guaranteed the way that you open it. If I save a file, if I forget to embed fonts in a PowerPoint file on my deck, I send that to somebody, they open it on PowerPoint on their end, maybe the fonts don't load, and then the whole layout gets scrambled. If you save something as a PDF, guaranteed safety.
So Kalita had a question: if you have more info than fits in one slide, do you recommend you still only use one slide for each topic and add extra info? What would you say in person rather than on the slide?
Sure. So there are two approaches to this, right? Like, one of them is doing what we call a build. So a build is effectively this. For me to go through kind of for me to go through each of these pieces, would be way too much information for a single slide. What I'm doing here is I'm showing you that we're covering a couple of points within this topic, but I'm only providing you kind of bite-sized amounts, and I talk through them gradually so that my verbal delivery can kind of guide you through the process instead of just having one massive information overload kind of slide. It's a gradual step-by-step process. So if you do have very dense, heavy amounts of information, break them out into multiple slides. If you find yourself getting down to like 30, 40, 50, some wild amount of slides, then maybe reconsider how much information you're trying to get across. There's this very common inclination, especially highly technical or deep tech companies, to try and provide an education in the course of a presentation. You can't do that. It's not even up for debate. It just is impossible. There isn't enough time and energy and attention in the room to gain enough of an understanding, like a deep understanding of what it is that you're doing, so that they can absorb heavy technical detail like that. To stay with a heavy technical example, the way that you counteract that, the way that you mitigate that, is that you talk a lot more about the utility than you talk about the mechanic. The utility is what it does. What does it do? What does it do for the user? What kind of outcomes does it provide its user? The mechanic is how it does it, right? So what's under the hood? For instance, let's take the subtitling here. The utility of the subtitling is that it improves accessibility and inclusivity and pops up on the screen during my presentation. That is the utility. How it does it is there's probably a whole bunch of natural language processing. I'm not sure whether it works better or worse if I'm online or offline. So maybe it's sending it to a server where it's being computed there versus on my desktop. That's the mechanic. For somebody that's just trying to understand the idea and trying to make an assessment onto whether they should continue to pay attention, whether they should continue to support it, the fact that it's being sent to the cloud and back and all that fun under the hood technical stuff is not particularly relevant to that risk assessment in that moment. Down the line, if you get into technical due diligence, all of those things will come out. But in the moment, the reason somebody uses a product will be the utility. You don't sell somebody the idea of using Instagram or Facebook or Twitter by describing IPv6, DNS, hosting, server stacks. You don't start there. You start with share photos. You share photos, and you're able to share photos or tweet or communicate or stay the most up to date on news stories or what's going on in the world. That is the utility. The mechanic is how it does it. And to cut down on heavy detail, what we generally see is that the utility is drawn into stark focus.
Excellent.
Okay, maybe take one more before we keep going.
Yeah, let's combine. There's two questions, so we could combine that. On the topic of font, what do you suggest in terms of the font size? Sure. And is there, are there any specific fonts that are more appealing to the audience? Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of, I'll break that down to a couple of points. And so, size-wise, you want to go for legibility, right? But also you don't want to absolutely fill out a slide as much as you can. It's a bit of a middle ground. So, for instance, here on this slide, this is one of the more text-heavy slides that we have, but there's still a fair amount of white space and negative space. The fact that you have white space and negative space on a slide isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to fill that with images and details and everything, because think of it as a magnet. That negative space is drawing the audience's attention towards a certain point. I want you to be focusing on the list here. I'm not too bothered with you focusing on the footer and the pitchbook word mark or whatever. I want you to fully singularly focus on what is on this list. That's why I leave out you're adding imagery or adding fluff or aesthetic, because what is going to sell, I mean, there's a balance to be struck between kind of stylizing things and providing information. Pitch decks are hyper optimized presentations. And so ideally what we try and focus on is communicate over all else. And we can revisit some of these topics a little later on, because I do have to cover some of these points in a second. But to that point, there are no set rules, but generally, if you want to look up kind of best practices in that case, looking at best practices in editorial design.
And what I mean by editorial design are magazines, books, posters, because they're essentially that is your best resource for the kind of a wealth of knowledge on legibility. If you start going down the UX path, you get down into a very deep rabbit hole with a lot of opinions and a lot of schools of thought, and you can spend the rest of your career trying to figure out what legibility really means. So UX design is hyper specific and very, it's a hyper specific and takes in all kinds of different things into account. And there is a large community of people that is discussing it and debating what is best. Editorial design has been around for as long as books have been around, and so there are established rules of legibility there. So to look into that, if you want to look into that any deeper, I'd go there. But generally, if you can put it up on a monitor and read it from the back of the room, you're doing well. If let's say because there is a variable there as well, is that you're not necessarily sure what your screen size is going to be as well, because you may have a massive, you have large projector, large room, small projector, small room. So taking my deck as an example, I wouldn't want to go any larger or any smaller than I'm using at the moment. I can't remember precisely what my sizing is here, but it's relative. It's relative to the size of the slide. So I can share these slides after the fact if you want to use them as a little guide. But templates, also free templates, are a good reference for that as well. The last point was, are there any particular fonts that are more appealing or less appealing? It really depends on the company's branding and look and feel. We're still trying to make sure that readability is the primary thing that we're taking care of. But in terms of stylistically, aesthetically, there are no better or worse fonts necessarily. It's more about what else is going on. Do you have dark text on a dark background? Is the contrast okay? Do you have way too much text on a slide? Are you not spending enough time on the slide for the user to, or for the audience to actually understand what's going on? Do you just present a massive block of info, then move on in 5 seconds, and everyone just gets a bit kind of jolted and isn't able to read, and they'll start to try and read, give up, start listening to you, and be kind of like darting back and forth. So the specific fonts don't particularly matter. What I would say though is be consistent and try to use Google fonts. The reason I say specifically Google fonts is that if you create a deck in PowerPoint and you upload it to Google Slides, which you often have to do, and I often do as well, because Google Slides and PowerPoint play nice generally. You won't run into any embedded fonts or custom fonts issues. Don't buy fonts and try and implement them into a deck, because you want your deck to be adaptable and very easily editable, because these are living documents. You are constantly changing them. You are constantly making little edits here and there. Who knows if you have to make an edit on a separate computer? I have all the fonts in the world on my desktop at home, on my primary kind of production machine. What if I'm out in the field? I have my tablet with me, which I sometimes take out to do presentations. Not anymore, but I have my tablet with me. I've got a couple of fonts on there that are specific to that presentation. What if the battery dies and I've got to open it on, some ancient desktop that is connected to the monitor, that is connected to the projector? And make a little edit there. We don't know. So you always have all of Google fonts, and those are basically just all the fonts that you can find on the within Google Slides, are all freely available. Google buys licenses for them and puts them out into the world for free. So that just to improve the look and feel and quality of their products. And so to round that point out, I tend to use Poppins a lot. I use Poppins Railway. It doesn't really necessarily matter which one it is, but don't go into tons of different weights, tons of different so light, bold, italic, underlined, like playing around with that. Try and keep your font selections very basic. A headline, kind of large impact statement, bold version that could go big, chunky, kind of, this is what we're doing. And then it goes into a subtitle and a bullet point or bulk text font size. So really, we're just talking about three font sizes. within the same family. So just pick a family and stick to it. Ideally, something that maps to your company's branding so that everything is consistent. But as long as you use generally accepted industry standard fonts such as Google fonts, you can't really go much wrong, but stick to ones that are freely available. Okay. All right, fantastic. Okay, so let's get back on track here. But it's good that some of these questions come up because these are all points that we are going to cover kind of down the line. But good to get a little bit of a primer. Okay, so one of the reasons that we're trying to create a structure like this and trying to formalize a lot of this is that we're dealing with two challenges during the presentation, right? We have a time budget and an attention budget, and there are certain things that we can do to kind of improve a time budget and improve an attention budget. Now I'm going to try something here. Okay, so generally with a time budget, what we're looking at is if this is a graph and we've got time and we've got attention, right? This is how much attention people are paying. This is how much time it's taking. Your attention at the beginning of a pitch is going to be very high because everybody's like, let's go. Hey, my name's yada yada. This is my company. I'm co-founder, whatever, right? High attention. Very quickly starts to drop. And it keeps going down, down, down. That now you're competing with LinkedIn, with Gmail, with Twitter, whatever. There's a little spike at the end because saying and wrap up, and then it's over. This is generally the amount of attention that people are paying to a presentation. Start high, has kind of a knee, starts to go down, spikes a little bit at the end, and then you're done. The ideal scenario here is that you can kind of hook them in this section and get that attention a little bit higher and keep it going. Now, how you do that, the thing is, you're not always going to get everyone. Some people are just going to drop into this valley and are not going to come back, and not going to be interested. But at least you can make sure in this early stage at the beginning here, you can make sure that you've given the audience enough attention at this stage here that they can make a decision in the moment whether to pay attention for the rest of the presentation. Because maybe it's somebody that doesn't just is not interested in the space, is not interested in investing at the moment. They need to leave, but are kind of considering whether to stay for one more pitch or not. And what this moment is generally is the overview. So our overview here, speaking about what it is generally that the company is doing, enough so that somebody in the room knows whether to put their phone down or not, whether to pay a bit more attention or not. Because otherwise, you're guaranteed to kind of, if you're going to talk about something really crucial to the business here, you're taking a risk that the crucial players in the room are not paying attention. If you get a quick point across very early on that kind of gives an overview of what it is that you're doing, you can avoid this kind of death valley. But you're always going to have some people go down there, right? So what we can do to try and mitigate the time budget, so 180 seconds, if we take 3 minutes as an example, the structure and the hierarchy of kind of what we covered before, that's one way to do it, so that we know that we're gradually getting through each point of we're getting through each point of the kind of key critical pieces of information that we're trying to get across, and that we are confident in. As we finish that point, we can move on to the next one. We finish that point, we're confident in moving on to the next one and the next one. Because otherwise what can happen is that you get, if we go back to the structure here, you may be focusing a ton on problem, and now you've only got 30 seconds to sprint through everything else. So you get down to solution and you go into deep, heavy technical detail, and you don't really address your competition or the revenue or the roadmap. There is a lack of balance in terms of how much you're talking about each thing. Every company has a little bit more, slants a little bit more in one or another direction, depending on what it is specifically that they're doing. But generally what we want to do is try and even it out so that within that time frame, excuse me, within that time frame, we can cover all of these points. And that the only way to figure that out is practice. There is no rule, there is no method, there is nothing other than just practice and actually doing it out loud and timing it that will show you whether that's going to work or not, or whether you are hitting your markers time-wise. And balancing that message, one of the most common things that we see that are time sinks are over reinforcing certain points. So instead of, say, what will generally happen, for instance, let me see if I can, is that let's say you make a statement, right? And then you support that statement with a couple of, you make a headline statement and you support that with a couple of reinforcing statements, and you move on. And this could be problem, you know, or drawing with the mouse. I usually do this on a whiteboard, so bear with me. Don't tell my design friends. Let's say problem, solution. Let's say these are two sections, right? What tends to happen is that there is a nervousness that kicks in, and they're just constantly going more detail, another point, another point, another point, another point, another point, another point, constantly over reinforcing, because there's a nervousness around whether you actually put enough information across so that the audience gets it. This is where we see these technical rabbit holes where all this time gets sucked up, and then maybe we're only talking about 2 points in a solution, and then having to sprint through the rest because we run out of time talking about problem. So ideally, what we want to do is try and kind of even it out across all those different verticals, and making those small refinements and those small refinements and adjustments, they gradually add up. So refining a little bit of wording here, dropping a point there, leaving another point maybe for the appendix, combining certain sections, or combining sections together if you're trying to say the same thing in two different sections. But all those small refinements, because we're dealing with such a tight time frame and such a low bar for attention, or such a low bar for people to drop their attention, that we really don't have the luxury of going down some of these rabbit holes and really over heavily reinforcing some of the individual points. Now, how do we deal with an attention budget? Time budget is very easy to measure. You've got a limited amount of seconds. When those seconds are up, the whistle blows and you're off, right? It's over. The attention budget is a lot harder to measure, but has a lot more dire consequences, because if you run down somebody's attention, they're going to check out and they might as well have never listened to any of it. And again, no matter how good the company is, if you overload your users' attention, they will check out and will just stop listening. And it doesn't matter how advanced your company is, or how incredible the opportunity is. And the three key things that we need to focus on there are reducing the friction. And what I mean by friction, and in this case specifically, is the friction between the presenter and what is on the slides. My style of presenting is very much basic light text slides, verbal delivery, as mentioned at the beginning. But I'm also not contradicting a ton of complex information that is on the slide, right? What I say generally links up with what is on the slide. It doesn't take you more than just a glance to kind of get an idea of what it is I'm talking about. If you lose your attention and need to come back to if you lose your attention because your phone rings, or your spouse or a kid calls, and you really have to take that call and you want to pay attention again, as soon as you glance back, you say, okay, what are we talking about? Attention. All right. Okay. Where are we in the process of talking about friction? Okay, good. I'm back on board. Right? So it's a matter of making it easy for your audience to pay attention, but also easy to get back on board when they do inevitably get distracted and lose attention. And so you're having tons of detail on the slide that you're not addressing, big paragraphs of text, big complex diagrams, all that kind of stuff, is going to clash with your verbal delivery if you're not addressing it directly, right? Because what's going to happen is they'll try and read off the slide, check out from listening to you for a second, refocus on you because they give up on trying to read the slide, and then just like dart back and forth for a second, and then just give up and check Twitter. So extremely common, and we've all been in that situation as an audience member as well. Avoiding jargon, huge one, and especially tech and deep tech and heavily technical or deep domain, say like insurance, fintech, medical tech. There's a lot of industry specific jargon. We don't have the luxury of using it. If you are presenting to a room of people who you know for a fact, because it's only 3 people, they know what you're talking about. Using these terms, using industry specific terms and jargon resonates with them. Sure, but that scenario is relatively rare. And even in those kind of scenarios, the ability to skip jargon and skip buzzwords and acronyms and just speak to the utility, what does it do, how does it do it in normal conversational language, displays a deep understanding of your own product and your own solution. Because what you're indirectly communicating is that I understand this so well, I understand my company and my space so well that I'm able to distill it into very easy to understand conversational language, because that is extremely difficult. Like simplifying things, simple is hard, but it's very hard to simplify things. And kind of falling back on, I mean, often where we see jargon pop in is are in situations where, say, somebody's trying to condense the language because there's way too much detail on a slide, and they'll refine it down to very specific industry terms, a very dense language, to a point where they kind of pass that Goldilocks zone or that kind of like middle zone of technical detail, but also conversational language, and they've gone way too far into refining and condensing things to a point where the audience has to actively unpack what they're saying to understand it. Right? And so if the audience has to kind of analyze and unpack your information while you're providing them constant amounts of more information, you're draining attention again, right? For instance, when blockchain started coming around, I wasn't familiar with the term KYC, for instance, which I know now is know your customer, and generally a very well understood term in financial circles and anything related to it. Those are not circles that I was generally moving in at the time or had prior knowledge of. And so I remember a specific instance where I was in a presentation. They were constantly talking about KYC, because blockchain, immutable, knowing your customer, digital identity, that kind of stuff. I wasn't aware of what KYC meant. So every time it came up, I was having to kind of backtrack, analyze things like, well, what does this KYC mean? I had to get my phone out, Google it, missed a couple slides. Like, it's not necessarily to your benefit to be throwing in industry specific jargon and terms, but that, I mean, we all kind of are aware that you shouldn't use jargon, but those are the reasons why. Is that you're diverting, you're diffusing the attention of the audience off what your narrative is. What a good story is somebody that's engaged with the story. And if you're sending people in all these different directions while you're trying to kind of take them on a journey, they'll just get confused and check out, because you're spending all their mental energy and their attention. Last point on that one, this is specifically for live presentations, which now obviously is a bit of they're not happening as much, but in the future they will happen again. But even over Zoom or remotely, speaking clearly and concisely. Now, I think I'm just in a room. If you're in a room, group of people, somebody at the back of the room is no less relevant to you than somebody at the front of the room in pitches. And so being able to speak to the very back of the room and actually project properly is incredibly important to getting your message across. Now, even though I am at home and I'm in my own space, I'm still talking at an elevated volume and kind of with more emphasis, because I want to make sure that my voice is coming across clearly and my message is coming across clearly. My shortcoming in that respect is I tend to speak a bit fast. And it's something that everybody has their own kind of things to work on presentation wise. My thing is that I generally speak fairly quickly, so I apologize for that and I generally try to kind of tone it down a bit and summarize points at the end of things. But ultimately, if you're at the front of a room speaking and somebody at the back of the room can't hear you, again, we run into that same problem of, if they can't hear you, they can't understand you. It doesn't matter how strong the opportunity is. If they can't hear you, it doesn't matter. They might as well not be in the room. And what tends to, and the most common reason for kind of the clarity in speech getting degraded is that it takes a lot more energy to speak at volume and to project to the back of the room. So if you write out a big, long, chunky script and you're going to try and kind of get through it, you are going to have to lower the volume and lower the amount of oxygen and the amount of effort that it's taken to get that across, because it's tiring. And especially if you're nervous, if you're nervous, the inclination is to, all right, I'm nervous. I got to make sure I get all this detail out so that they understand it and they understand how amazing this is. So the speech cadence tends to speed up, but the volume drops because getting that much more information out takes a lot of energy and a lot of just effort. And so it tends to get fast, tends to get quiet, because you're essentially just blurting out as much information as you possibly can. Knowing which points you need to emphasize, knowing which points you need to emphasize, where you need to pause, where you need to summarize, tonality, emphasis, dramatic pauses. They all play into helping your audience kind of maintain that attention. Because again, if somebody is speaking at a low volume very quickly, very likely that people are going to check out. Now, one of the kind of super common problems that we encounter, and something that we've addressed in a couple of previous points and questions, is information overload, right? So this is a real slide, right? It's a massive amount of information. There's no intuitive structure to how it actually functions or what's actually going on there. Effectively, this is a deck of, say, 50 to 60, 70, 80 slides on one slide. There's no hope for an audience member to be able to understand this. And I mean, this is from a deck for procurement process for the Pentagon, so it's from the defense base. But it's extremely complex. There's a bunch of legal reasons why all that information is on there. But I see these kind of decks and these kind of presentations as well from startups, especially very heavily technical ones. We see engineering diagrams, we see flows, we see org charts, all kinds of things can pop up like this. The idea is to put like this big impressive detail up there so that you kind of wow the audience. And it's like, oh wow, this is so in depth. Doesn't work. It doesn't work in your favor. Now, the only exception to that is that if you've made contact with an alien species that has showed you their language, which is an instant way of providing a massive amount of information all at once, you've been able to analyze that language and synthesize it and put it into your deck. Fantastic. But I mean, really good job. But ultimately, no, you can't do that, right? We're squishy humans. We read left to right, right to left, up, down, wherever you are in the world. ABC. 1, 2, 3. We understand information in linear chunks, and so providing a route through a complex slide like this. If this slide was broken down into 30 slides in a deck, it would be a lot easier to digest. It would take more time, but it would be a lot more digestible, right? Versus the intimidating factor of just wall of text, because effectively this is really just an image. It isn't actually paragraphs. It isn't actually text. It's just an image of text. There is no information being communicated. There are no clear points. There is no hierarchy. There is no structure. There is no reading direction, nothing, right? So we're going to keep things incredibly simple. But condensing that down into hyper refined language can lead you into something like this. Complete nonsense, but read it for the sake of argument. Our disruptive sustainability platform opens new ways to monetize the consumer space through two-sided deployments of value add, all backed by blockchain-enabled AI algorithms that reward user referrals with our ERC20 tokens. This is obviously gibberish, but what it is a pitch-shaped object. It is something that looks and sounds like a pitch, but is in fact not a pitch. It's just a collection of buzzwords. It's an overly complicated, kind of nonsensical chunk of information, but to an audience member, an overly technical explanation of something that is loaded with jargon, spoken quietly and at speed, effectively is the same thing. they struggle to connect the dots on what the significance is and what is actually going on, what the value of what you're trying to present them is, or what the story is. Because ultimately, what a story is just a linear, step-by-step narrative, or step-by-step chunks of information that you can see connections between. They lead one into another, taking you from the start of something, giving you some context of the world, leading you through a process to some kind of a conclusion. Startup storytelling, which is a term that's thrown around a lot, is actually relatively straightforward. There isn't some deep theoretical well of information that you need to dig into to figure out what startup storytelling really is. What we're really talking about is conversational speech and clarity of of conversational, taking complex ideas and just putting them in human conversational terms and conversational language, not reading off a script, not running through a ton of jargon and buzzwords, not leading not diverting attention into all kinds of different angles throughout the presentation. Just a linear, a step-by-step structured conversational human interaction, right? For instance, and to that point about reading off a script, one of the things that tends to happen there is that there is this reliance on trying to kind of fall back on a script because of nerves, because you have a lot of information that you want to get across. I recommend writing a script. I do not recommend using it. So write a script to be able to kind of work on your wording and see where are you spending way too much, are you spending too much time on problem or solution or market or competition? Like what are the peaks and valleys of your presentation, and do you have it relatively well spaced out and balanced? But to try and take a pitch, trying to take a script into a presentation makes it like the tone at which you're speaking. Written text is very different than a verbal delivery. So it doesn't account for when you need to stop and breathe, where you're trying to emphasize, where you want to take a dramatic pause for emphasis, tonality, whether something is exciting or whether it's kind of dire, and there's a whole range of differences there. It's kind of the difference between like Morse code and sheet music. Morse code is the incredibly simple, just what is the information code-wise. Notation, musical notation takes into account the beats, the tonality, the ups and downs, the peaks and valleys of what's actually going on. And it becomes very difficult to follow if you're just listening to a constant fire hose stream of complex, deep information, and complex information. Very quickly you will run out of you will deplete your audience's attention. And so indirectly, what is actually going on there as well is that, and this is in an example where, say, somebody's reading off a slide or reading off a piece of paper or reading off a phone, the questions that are going to start coming up and the cynicism that's going to start building with your audience is based on, well, how well does this person actually know their business and their space? They've had to revert to a script to be able to present it. Do they? Oh, I think my headset just kicked out. They're going to have to revert to a script to be able to actually present at any level. They don't have an intuitive, deep understanding of their own space, so that's a concern and a red flag, right? Did they even practice? Are they prepared for this presentation? Is this the first time they're presenting? Is this a competent founder? It's a whole range of reasons that these things could cause you problems. I'm going to take 2 seconds just to plug in my headset so I don't drop off. And if it's, maybe we could take a question or two.
Yeah, for sure. So, what are your thoughts on Google Slides? I think you kind of covered, the between PowerPoint and slides and all of that already. Is it true that you lose the audience if you have more than 10 slides because they have a very short attention span, mostly less than a minute?
I mean, is it true that you lose the audience after 10 slides? I mean, the number of slides doesn't necessarily matter so much as the amount of content that you put on those. The number of slides doesn't necessarily matter as much as the amount of content that you put on those slides. So if those 10 slides, if you're using 10 slides as your kind of benchmark, and you just load those with massive diagrams, big blocks of paragraphs, and all that, that's not going to help you at all. The more accurate benchmark is think of it in a kind of a mental bandwidth kind of way versus how much data is on the per slide. It's how much are you able to, like, if you were going to explain it to somebody in verbal one-on-one conversational language, is it going to take you 3 minutes to present those 10 slides, 60 seconds to present those 10 slides, or is it going to take you an hour to present those 10 slides? Because any of those situations could come up. I've seen presentations that are 5 slides that take 2 hours. I've seen presentations that are 40 slides and take 3 minutes. But they're rapid. It's the speed and rapidity of content. Really, what is the underlying question there is how complex is your message? Like, how complex is the story that you're trying to tell? How much detail are you trying to get across? Is it valuable to the objectives and the goals of the presentation to provide that much detail? Are you balancing it? Are you balancing it across those structures? So I wouldn't get caught up on the actual number of slides. I'd be more concerned about how much information you're trying to get across. And the best benchmark for that is to, at a conversational pace, out loud, and not in your head, and not reading off a screen or a piece of paper, out loud, present to your phone. Voice memo, put it at the back of the room, present to your phone, and then review it. It's going to sound weird listening to your own voice. It always is. It's uncomfortable. Nobody likes it. I used to be in a band, and we did a bunch of touring, and we would have these very early morning, very hungover radio interviews where you can hear your own voice in the headset as you're talking. You're just like trying to hold it together. It's like, this is it's never comfortable. Right? We do those all the time, but it'll give you a reality check on how much you're really trying to say, because you could look at a bunch of slides with X amount of bullet points per slide and think, okay, I bet I could get through this in 4 minutes. Doesn't look that complicated. When you actually try and speak it out, and you actually try and communicate it verbally, then you really get, and you record it, you get a bit of a reality check on how much information are you really trying to get across. So to answer the question, 10 heavily loaded slides and 10 very simple slides are 2 very different presentations. The number of slides doesn't matter. The common denominator there is how much information are you trying to get across, and is it valuable to your objectives to get to spend that amount of time on that amount of information. All right. Okay. Excellent. Great. Let's get back on track here, because what I'm running through now basically just a run of kind of common problems that we tend to see. And then we can jump into some more in-depth Q&A. And I've got time this evening, so we can slip into a bit longer Q&A if people are into it. But we'll jump back to some questions in a second. Now, from a design perspective, in terms of actually putting together a deck, we covered this slightly earlier on. So I'll kind of I'll run through this fairly quickly. You do not want to create a picture of beauty but not of substance. And what I mean by that is that a very good looking deck is not necessarily going to wow an audience and get them to either invest or commit or engage, more so than a well-structured message, because the message has to be above all else. It's why, for the previous question, what did I revert back to? The message. It's what you are trying to say. Because what you're trying to say is the same thing that somebody's trying to read, and no amount of design and graphics can fix bad content, right? The aesthetics and cool diagrams and cool infographics and branding, whatever it can support and amplify a good message, but if you don't have a good message to start with, however much design time or creative or aesthetic you put into it is not going to make a huge difference. In terms of actually putting together something, consistency is a lot more important. My deck is incredibly basic and consistent. The reason for that is that I don't want to divert attention much away from the fundamental theory. I don't want to, but also because this deck per workshop and per presentation tends to change quite a lot, I need to be able to very quickly make snap changes to it, even though I am a experienced designer with the capabilities to make a lot of these infographics and these aesthetic additions. It isn't necessarily to my benefit to have super flashy. There's a balance, there's a balancing act as well. It doesn't have, you can't have a deck that looks like complete trash, but going deep on aesthetic is not necessarily going to bump it up. It'll help a bit, but there is a point of diminishing return. And this deck is just 2 fonts, 1 color, and that's it's the same font, but just 2 weights of it, bold and irregular, and that's it. It makes it very easy for me to edit. It makes it very easy for me to make various versions, and it's also in line with branding that I'm developing. So it's consistent and it's recognizable, and it's not kind of diverting people's attention away from what the core message is, which is really me speaking. This is an assist, and it's an assist, and it's a tool that I use in the presentation to support what I'm saying. The vast majority is my message and what it is I'm saying verbally. And so that's where we get into the actual, what we do about the verbal delivery and the performance, and how you, and once you have that message in place, how you actually get ready for your pitches, because we've seen tons of fairly well put together messages, but then when you actually have to deliver it, especially verbally, there's a risk that it can fall flat, right? So in terms of evaluating the situation that you're in, you want to take a look at who is it that you're presenting to, what did they want, what do you want? Here again, this is for, what is the room that you're going into, what is the scenario, what is the engagement that you're moving into, and what is your best, what is the best avenue for you to go down in terms of your messaging. Previously, we mentioned a financial route, a technical route, a recruiting route, a general hype kind of public route. Those are some standard ones, but those are some kind of standard angles. But if you have a simple, easy to edit deck, you only need an hour's notice or 2 hours notice to be able to, okay, we're going into this room with these people. We know that they're concerned about these things. They want this. What we think we can get out of this engagement with them are these and these and these things. Let's change up the ask a bit. Let's skip some of these technical slides and put a little bit more financial information, or balance it out like that. If you have one of these buddies, these infographics going on, what if you got to drop a point? What if you have to add a point? What if, in a worst case scenario, one of the things that I've seen is the, say for instance, this globe in the middle here, in the middle right section. It looks great with 6 points. What if you only have 4 points to talk about your global strategy? Well, you can drop 2 of those, but what I see more frequently is people will make up an extra point or 2 because it looks good. And it's not necessarily, that isn't to the benefit of the message or the benefit of the company. That's just to make it look flashy and make you feel a bit better about the presentation. The message above all else, right? So whatever supports the message, we have to focus on that. It's very easy, especially if you're nervous about your presentations, to go down this rabbit hole of like excessive design, more and more design, and thinking that will improve things. The time you should be spending is on practicing your verbal out loud delivery, because it both helps you formulate your thought process and what it is that you're trying to say and what you're trying to get across, but it also builds up that mental and physical muscle memory and how to actually present. How to present more effectively, and you could also be spending time on writing or doing more research or reaching out to advisors. I mean, the life of a founder is a very busy one, or it should be, and so it's a question of resource allocation. Do you put a ton of resources, whether it's time or money, into making a really flashy deck, or do you put time and resources into having an excellent message? I'd opt for message 99 times out of 100. But there are hacks or ways around it. If you are going to go and use templates and use kind of a pre-baked kind of design package, one of those $30 for 25,000 slides kind of deals, sure, go ahead. But remind yourself constantly the message. pick layouts and pick layouts and example layouts and supporting graphics that are easy to edit and easy to adjust on the fly, because you don't want to trip yourself up just before a presentation, or not adjust the presentation for a room because it's too difficult to edit, or even worse, having to get hold of a freelancer or a designer because you don't have the software to edit a layout like that because it was made in Photoshop or Illustrator or whatever. All very common occurrences. Now, so back to the performance and kind of how we're navigating that. As you're preparing your materials, again, mentioned adjusting your message to the crowd. On a practical note, again, physical pitching is kind of out of the question at the moment, but on that point, bringing your own flash drive with a PDF is just going to save the day. No matter what device you have to present, because you never know if the Wi-Fi is not going to work, because it isn't guaranteed that you will always, if you're showing up to a venue or to a location, that you have access to the internet. You would think so, but having your deck on Google Slides, maybe that's all well and good while you're at home, or while you're, say, at YSpace, where you have reliable Wi-Fi. What if you're at 77 King in those in the TD Center towers? 40th floor, your 4G isn't working particularly well. You're presenting in an office where the Wi-Fi either isn't working, or you haven't been given the guest password yet. The computer that you're on is not connecting to the internet properly. It's all kinds of reasons that you can actually not have internet access. So just having a flash drive with the deck on it in a PDF format, so you can open it on virtually any device, will save the day. Last point on this one, in terms of knowing your pitch versus memorizing it, that's kind of the difference between trying to memorize a pitch versus knowing your content is that one is possible and one is not. It is impossible to memorize a verbatim word for word pitch precisely. You can get pretty close, but it both is extremely difficult and comes off fairly robotic. I tend to say the same things per workshop, but it does shift around. I don't use very specific wording, because the amount of mental energy I'm putting into remembering what the next bit of information is, what the wording is hyper optimized. Like, this is these hyper specific kind of wordings that is just kind of a way to try and feel a bit better about going into these scenarios and alleviating some stress or some nerves, is not necessarily going to do you a lot of good, because once you're there, once you're actually there, your nerves are going to kick in, stress is going to kick in. When you're presenting, you're going to start forgetting your words, forgetting the things is going to freak you out a little bit, and you're going to have to backtrack. And so the real difference there is that knowing your pitch is just understanding the content and being able to speak to it naturally, versus having to rely on some pre-canned, supposedly hyper-optimized version of your presentation. You can have general points that are similar, but write that script, don't take it in, so that you've figured out generally what you're going to talk about, but have the ability to speak and ad-lib and kind of talk on the fly. Because especially when you move into Q&A, if you have this really shiny, hyper-polished, robotic kind of no pauses, no flubs, no mistakes, it comes off incredibly robotic and difficult to follow, because it just isn't conversational. It's like a news statement. And then you transition into Q&A, and your speaking style changes. So it's just made obvious that you have had to prepare a canned script because of the nerves surrounding presenting properly. So knowing your pitch, understanding the space, understanding your company, knowing what you're talking about generally, not being afraid to pause or repeat yourself in the middle of a sentence, or have to reiterate something, is just going to make it a lot easier to get through, because each of those each of those stumbles or those hiccups are going to, on the one hand, make it a bit more human. But if you are trying to get rid of every single one of those hiccups, what's going to happen is that if you don't allow those hiccups and those stumbles and those kind of mishaps to happen during practice, and you get comfortable with just pushing through them, you make them into fateful moments. So the danger of those hiccups becomes a lot more scary, because if you as you're practicing, if you don't go through and just do a full run and push through those kind of hiccups and push through those kind of stumbles and get used to pushing through them, every time you run into one of those hiccups, it's going to present a real fear and danger to you during the presentation. So get used to not presenting particularly well. Get used to having to pause and scratch your nose, repeat yourself, or have to reiterate a term, or change the wording a little bit and ad-lib and speak on the fly, because it comes across a lot more natural, and indirectly you're showing that, look, I intuitively understand my company and my space, right? And the only way to really develop that is practice. Just practice, 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 practice. But what does that really mean, right? What you're trying to do is develop mental muscle memory and physical muscle memory. The act of just reading out reading out your script or reading out your presentation off a slide or off a piece of paper or a phone may help you memorize it and may make you very familiar with the content. But the actual ability to speak it out, understand where you are, where you're waffling on and needing to take a break and take a deep breath, or where to put the emphasis on some of your wording. You don't develop that any other way than actually speaking it out at a kind of presentational volume way. And in terms of tactics, again, phone at the back of the room, whether it's your living room, bedroom, wherever, and just speak it out, listen to it back. And to hold yourself accountable to actually practicing. Set yourself a goal of, I need 10 recordings of this pitch, but none of them can be identical. Right? So slide a little bit to and fro in your wording so that you get comfortable with kind of moving around a little bit, so that if you don't hit exactly word for word accurate, it doesn't matter. They're not fatal mistakes. They're not fatal hiccups to the presentation. Because defining those really precise terms is what is going to trip you up. Because I see a lot of founders try and do that as a way to try and kind of prepare and allay some nerves, but it really is counterproductive. So in terms of actually how you practice, my one big recommendation is that if you're trying to practice a presentation, don't do it in chunks. Don't try and practice the first bit again and again and again and again and again to get that perfect, and then move on to the next one, get that perfect, and then move on to the next one, get that perfect. Because you need to have the ability to go through and push through those stumbles. So as you're practicing each of those run-throughs, do it from start to finish, all the way through, regardless of how often you mess up, or how often you mess up, or you get stopped or hiccup or run into a roadblock. Push through it, because that will train your ability to push through hiccups, push through the door opening, a phone going off, the projector turning off, technical difficulties. You build that ability to handle those situations, and there's no other way than doing it out loud and repetitive and repeatedly. So we've covered this one in terms of the PowerPoint, Keynote, Google Slides. Don't use Keynote. It is my favorite program to make stuff in out of the presentation software, but because it plays so badly with other software and the compatibility issues is such a liability, it's too dangerous to recommend using it, because it can really screw up a presentation if you can't open your file. And the most common times that we see a file that is unopenable, it's a Keynote file. So PowerPoint and Google Slides play nice together, but regardless, always save a PDF, always bring a flash drive, and do not trust the Wi-Fi, because it is incredibly fickle, and there are definitely scenarios and locations where you can't even fall back on 4G or mobile internet. Again, another point on physical spots. If you get a microphone to hold, just plant it in the center of your chest, point it at your face, and plant it in the center of your chest, point it at your face, speak at a general, a little bit higher than conversational volume, and let the AV people deal with the rest. If you can project to the first 3 or 4 rows, the microphone is supposed to do the rest, because you can't really project that much further reasonably. I mean, without like extensive training, and this is something that generally just is a theatrical performance, or kind of a theatrical basis of being able to really project the back of the room. Unless you have that ability, the best you can do is project to the first 4 or 5 rows, and then let the microphone take over the rest. Bringing a clicker, like, why did I put mine? It's so ironic, I just put it down. Having a clicker with you is huge, because it both serves a purpose as being able to advance your slides, obviously, but also as a little bit of just a tiny little stress ball, take out a little bit of tension, be able to wave your hands around a little bit and kind of release a little bit of stress. I mean, even if you are doing a Zoom call, again, like COVID's kind of thrown a lot of some of this theory into a bit of disarray, but because we generally fairly seldom see people pitching remotely. It tended to be a bit of an anomaly. Now it has become the norm. But even so, like, I'm standing, like, this is the desk I'm on is a standing desk. I move around a bit, shift my weight to release a bit of tension. If I'm sitting down, I'm crunching together my lungs, my ability to breathe, and my ability to project properly and wave my arms around and release some of that stress. So if you are on a call or you are presenting remotely, do so standing up if you can, looking directly into the camera and pitching directly into the camera helps a lot as well, if you can. And having a clicker anyway, because the actually having to go down to a keyboard, sure, it works, but you want to keep your energy levels high and make it as recognizable as a pitch as possible. So even though you are at home, still try and get a clicker. They're dirt cheap on Amazon. Still get them quite easily. And dongles. This is just for largely for the MacBook Pro crowd, and being able to connect to a projector as well if you're showing up to a spot. Don't assume that you'll be able to connect your laptop to their projector unless you have whatever the output of your laptop is, whether it's an HDMI or a Type-C or I mean, for some ancient machines it would be a VGA. But just have whatever the relevant connectors are for you to get out of the laptop into an HDMI. If you always have that with you, you always have kind of a fallback and a fail-safe to at least plug into a monitor or a TV. Most likely a projector. We don't see many projectors that only have VGAs anymore, but an HDMI cable and a dongle, it's a nice little insurance policy. So getting into the kind of the back end of what actually goes into some of these pitches, one of the most scary ones is stage fright, right? Like nerves. We're not necessarily all performers. I mean, I have a performance background, and there are people in the ecosystem that do have performance backgrounds, and so getting up in front of people is something we're a bit more used to, but they are still scary. It's always scary. Like, I'm at home in a very comfortable environment, and I'm, my stress levels and nerves are a little bit elevated because I'm speaking, I'm delivering, I want to do well, and I want to get a lot of information across, and it is physically difficult to speak for a straight, we're at an hour and 40 minutes now. So there's always a set of nerves that comes along with it, and there are some things that you can do to counteract that. Knowing your pitch, not having to memorize it, obviously going to make a big difference, because in a pinch, I've been asked to replace a speaker sometimes that is dropped out, and so I have just kind of jumped in or been asked to jump in. And because I just know my content and I can intuitively speak about it even without slides, it's not as scary. So knowing that the engagement that you're going into is something that you are well prepared for, and something that you are set up to perform in and have done before, and you've done your practicing, you've spoken out loud, you know your pitch, you know your content very well, it means that it'll make that engagement a lot less scary. It's a bit of a cruel joke trying to get enough sleep as a founder, especially if you're high building, high growth velocity kind of mode. But being well rested, there's a night and day difference between being exhausted and being well rested before a pitch. So if you have a particularly crucial pitch, make sure that you get a couple of hours extra sleep in, even to the detriment of preparing or reading through your deck again and again and again. Your ability to ad lib and to kind of speak off the cuff and respond quickly to conversations is going to come is going to be a lot easier if you come from if you're starting from a place of being well rested. Stretching and actually preparing your body, because this is a very physical activity. Pitching, very basic, so just rolling out your shoulders, rolling out your neck, mouth. Maybe do that in private. But generally just kind of preparing your body and doing a couple of little vocal warm-ups is definitely going to help, because one of the things you tend to see is founders starting at a relatively kind of low volume and kind of ramping up into a higher volume later on in the pitch or kind of down the line. What's happening is they're warming up during the presentation and not necessarily starting on a, starting strong and ending strong. They'll start kind of stumble for a slide or two and then kind of get into the flow of it and really take off. Ideally, you want to start strong, end strong. The way you do that from a physical perspective is just, bit of stretches, bit of warm-ups. Deep breaths just before you're presenting, lowering that stress a bit, oxygenating the blood a little. Definitely helps, especially for a 3-minute, just a very quick 3-minute pitch. You want to just calm down a little bit, not to panic, not to be too worried. Big help. Depending on how much sleep you manage to get, having some tea or having some coffee can help. Tea is going to keep you a little bit less awake, but doesn't make you as jittery and as stressed out. If you're completely exhausted and just need like a real boost of energy to get you through it, sure, down a quadruple espresso, whatever you need to do in that situation. But understand that in doing so, there is a trade-off in your nerves and your jittery your voice is going to crack a little bit more. You're going to come across a little bit more nervous. You start sweating a bit more because you're just going to have elevated cortisol levels. Not necessarily ideal for responding to tricky questions as well. Your mood is going to be a little bit off. Aaron Hamilton from Vantage came up with this last point I heard in a presentation of his, which I found really interesting. I actually tried this myself, and it's worked. Building companies building companies at this stage is generally, if you're moving quickly and doing something really significant with heavy impact, it tends to be a chain of dumpster fires. There is one emergency after another that you're trying to deal with. And on any given day, one of those dumpster fires may be going on just before a pitch. So you may be in bad mood, some really horrific things going on with the company, or some deal is falling through, or something bad is happening, and your mood is affected by that. You bring that energy and you bring that mood with you to the table and to the performance when you're actually pitching. So listening to a little bit of stand-up, a funny podcast, some memes or cat videos or whatever, just kind of tweaking that emotional state in the 15-20 minutes leading up to your pitch. Big help, right? And then once it's done, the after action, post pitching, what are we looking at here? In terms of actually like following up after the pitch, on the one hand, depending on the room, you may or may not have Q&A. 99% of the time, you will have some Q&A at some level. And the ultimate objective there is to baffle objections. People are going to be poking holes in your idea. They're going to be poking holes in your idea for the purposes of arriving at some more detail and some more truths about it. And getting more detail. Now, a couple of kind of straightforward rules there is that you want to respond to each question quickly, relatively quickly, concisely, and respectfully. Even if somebody is asking a nasty question or a difficult question or something that you've already mentioned in the deck, if you show a reluctance or an annoyance with somebody not having listened to you, like reiterating maybe a point that they didn't understand, it isn't necessarily their fault. Maybe you didn't emphasize the point enough. Maybe they weren't paying attention. You don't know. So the default So if you default to a respectful, understanding answer, even if it says, well, what do you do? And you just told them what you do, it's like, yeah, sure, good question. This is what we do. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Next question. As what is going on during that Q&A process as well is not just a kind of a data analysis in terms of what is it that you're doing and what is it that you're doing and what are the merits of the company. It's also a character judgment to a degree. How does this founder perform under pressure? How does this founder react to nasty questions? I know of a couple of examples specifically where investors have done it on purpose to see how, because they've heard that, this founder's a bit prickly. Let's see what they're like under pressure, and they will jab them with a tricky question. Especially heavily technical companies, they want to see whether are they also competent leaders? Can they manage their teams properly? There's a whole range of reasons that just a respectful, short, to the point answer is incredibly important. Because the strength of a president, it's almost I wouldn't say necessarily a 50-50 split, but there's a lot riding on how you handle Q&A. Because they'll try and trip you up and ask things that they'll try and trip you up on and ask things that you haven't necessarily addressed yet and haven't necessarily covered, or try and or throw you a curveball. And depending on how you react to that, it can speak volumes about how you function as a leader, or what you actually know about the space, or what your communication style is. How you handle those kind of tricky questions can really show a lot. Because ultimately what you're after is another interaction. If you're prickly during Q&A and you're difficult about asking questions and so you're difficult or struggle to respond and not respond respectfully, they're not necessarily going to want to interact with you as a founder again. It's not a universal rule, but I'm just saying these are the risks you're running, right? So these are the risks you're running by not handling your Q&A properly. Now, one of the exercises we do when working on decks, some people nightmare questions. Nightmare questions are basically all the things you don't want to put up front in your deck and call out as kind of heavy weaknesses, but things that in conversation are highly likely to come up. You make your own judgments about whether you want to bring up those things early on or not, whether you want to preempt them. But at a very minimum, know what your nightmare questions are and formulate responses to them, because there are two scenarios that can play out there. On the one hand, you can get a very difficult question with the back of your mind going, boy, all right, we do it by doing this, that, and the other, and you go down this kind of detailed spiral of trying to reinforce the question, trying to answer the question until the person who asked is like, oh, all right, okay, I just wanted a little bit of information. But the reason those rabbit holes and those spirals kind of kick off is the nervousness around whether the audience member that asked the question, or the judge or the investor, or whoever it is, whether they have gotten enough information to actually allay and understand the response, and actually to get a satisfactory response, so to speak. And so sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. That being able to respond to tricky questions like that being incredibly important. And so the other scenario that can kind of play out versus having to kind of tap dance your way through it is that you know that question is coming. You know that question is coming, and you know that you have an answer for it. So just let them finish the question. Don't assume you know what they're going to ask. Just let them finish. Let them finish the question, and then walk into your response just gradually. Because again, like being interrupted in the middle of a question, and then answering a question that wasn't the question, like answering a separate question because you thought that was what they were going to ask, but they're actually asking something else, can also come off. It can come off arrogant. It can come off presumptive, and kind of and sour that interaction a little bit. So with that, and very little breath left, because generally when we do these things, there's a lot of back and forth, and I get kind of an opportunity to kind of to pause and breathe and take a sip of water and get a sip of coffee. This has been quite the marathon of getting through this. So I think now what we'll do is kind of transition into a bit more in-depth Q&A. And I'm going to find my water bottle, but I can still hear you, Nafis. Yeah, we can roll into some questions.
Fantastic. So Amir had asked, what are the key points we should put into consideration when we want to tell a story about a product or service for a client? So for example, people scanning or skimming through a website, how can you grab their attention by telling a story about the product or service?
Could you just repeat the beginning of that question?
Yeah, what would be the key points that you should put into consideration when you're telling the story of a product or a service?
Well, it depends on what
specifically, he's talking about when you're reaching out to clients.
Right. So that's more of a bit of a sales kind of sales approach versus pitching, but the fundamentals still apply. Is that you need to be able to understand, at least on some basic level, what it is that, like, how does this product relate to your customer, and what is the relevance of it to their day to day. And very seldom is that deep technical detail. It's usually what is the utility of it, what kind of an outcome can it provide the company, and how does it do it in a conversational straightforward manner. And so depending on the product, that could be all kinds, there's all kinds of structures that could be. But do you know what specifically is the product?
Amir, would you?
Yeah. So actually, I'm referring to some websites, or even some sales speech, as you mentioned, that someone is providing a new service, a new product, and they just want to just grab the attention. That what is the story behind of this product or service? It was blah blah blah. It's started by this, and it's gonna help you, resolve this problem. And we are utilizing this sort of services in order to just resolve this problem of yours. So I just want to know that as I said, what are the key points that we should put into the consideration when we want to just form a story behind a product, a service?
Well, so the way that you build up a story like that, and depending on whatever it is that you need to gradually ramp up. So it's a bit difficult to say specifically what the points are. It's like, you need to speak about the value, you need to talk about the price, then you got to speak about what the customer journey is. Like, it doesn't really work like that necessarily.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt you, but you mentioned something. I just want to take a note, but it was too fast.
Go ahead, Amir.
Yeah. So you said that first of all, we should just talk about the utility and then the problem. Do not mention technical things. Can you just point them out? I just want to take a note. Yeah,
absolutely. So in terms of the I mean, as an example, if we talk about Instagram or some of these kind of very broadly used kind of consumer products.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, they are now, I mean, maybe a bad example, because they are now at a level where it's intuitive to everybody what Instagram is for, because it's synonymous with the type of posting. But really, in terms of constructing a message like that, start identifying what the key thing that your product does is kind of your first step in figuring that out. Like, what is it providing the user? Like, what is it doing for the user? What kind of action, or what kind of situation is it enabling? Or what kind of outcome is it enabling for the user, or for whoever is engaging with the product at a very simple level initially, and then gradually, as you a simple high level kind of tagline and story is very difficult to come up with, because actually, like, getting into deep, expansive detail that's the easy bit. It's always easier to add on more and more detail. What's tricky is to figure out the tricky bit, and what, again, like a lot of our time spent on, is figuring out what is that high level message, and it tends to come after some time of actually using the product, having users engage with the product and seeing what your actual kind of mission or vision is, or what kind of an outcome it's enabling for those users. So the point specifically, it's a tricky one now, because I mean, if you gave me a specific company, I could pick that, like a specific company and a product, then in that case, perhaps, you know, it would be a bit easier to pick apart what exactly it is. But because that is the high level issue that we're trying to solve here, right? In a single issue. And so I mean, best practices, I mean, the best practice in explaining something is having it simple and then gradually building up detail over time. Now, figuring out what that story is, often what a founder thinks that story is not necessarily it. So engaging with your users and engaging with peers and having them tell you what your product does, and having them tell you, whether that's beta users or advisors or whoever that may be, figuring out what they're actually using it for and what it means to them is going to give you a bit of a better idea of what that overarching initial point is. And then you can start layering on, supporting detail and supporting kind of elements to that. And so what the specific points are, I'm not particularly, that kind of depends on the company, depends on the product. But what I can say is that how you arrive at that story is by talking to the people that actually use it, not the people that built it. So, and that includes yourself, right? So what you think your product does is not necessarily what your users think your product does. And so,
yeah, very good point.
Open conversations like that with, if I explain my business to somebody else and say, what do you do? Oh, I do PowerPoint for startups. That person doesn't have to synthesize or work on that explanation a whole lot to explain it to somebody else. So somebody down the street who I've engaged with is then asked, hey, Ben, what does he do? I was like, he does PowerPoint for startups. Like, it's a very easy, high level thing. But when you talk to some of my former clients, they don't necessarily say that I do PowerPoint for startups. They say, well, he helps us understand our businesses a bit better and be able to speak about them. And that was I started out running this as a design service, and I eventually, through the process of actually hearing what my users were talking about and what my clients were talking about, the value I was providing, I realized, well, this is actually a writing and a discovery service, because I understand operations and I understand product and I understand marketing and the fundraising environment. I can have those I'm able to have those conversations with individual companies and actually eke out what the core story is, and build a very quick understanding of what the business is and create a story around that. I initially thought it was just a design service, right? So the way that you get to that simple story, you probably there's a concept that we're dealing with quite frequently called founder blindness, and I have this as well, and I see it in almost every company that I work with, that what you think the product is isn't necessarily, or what you think the explanation of the product isn't necessarily it, because you know so much about the product and you have all the intimate detail. That's why we tend to get into these technical spirals and these detail spirals, because it's all intuitive to you as a founder, because you built the product. It is, it's your baby. You should know everything about it. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're the best suited person to summarize what it's all about. The best people to deal with are the people that use it, are the people that live with the product as a user. So if you're trying to sell your product to a user, whatever that product is, what is that user, what are existing users or beta users or other people's understanding of the product is probably going to be a more accurate guide. It's not a given that it'll be 100% accurate, and you will have to kind of edit and synthesize what you get in. But that is the route, so to speak, like the route to figuring out what your basic, simple explanation of the product is, or what that story is, and how you construct that messaging, is not necessarily, some contemplative, go out into the desert and do a bunch of shrooms and kind of come to some enlightened state. It's like, I know what the product's about now. It's it's talking to your users, right? It's talking to users, people that actually use it. What does it mean to them? How do they really use it? Does that answer your
Thank
question?
you. Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks a lot, Amir.
Awesome. The next one. So Don, he mentioned that earlier on you talked about having 13 key slides in a deck. So how would you adopt that for a 5-minute pitch versus a 15-minute pitch?
Yeah, so the structure doesn't necessarily change, because this could be a 60-second pitch. The thing is the speed, the difference is the speed at which you go through it. And so what I mean by the speed at which you go through it is the amount of content you're trying to get across, the amount of content that you're trying to get across for the time frame that you're given. One of the tactics that we use to consolidate some of this messaging is, well, for instance, maybe skip overview, jump directly into problem, talk about problem and talk about the where was it? We'll talk about problem individually, maybe speak to solution and roadmap, or solution and traction at the same time. Speak about revenue and revenue model and advantage at the same time, or revenue model and traction at the same time. So instead of spending a whole section of the presentation on revenue, you speak about, well, we run on a SaaS model, and so far we've managed to get X amount of users on the platform. So that's that's 2 out of 13 slides in 1.5 seconds. So if you really want to sprint through something, it's a matter of combining those sections and being brief in how much information you put in each of the buckets. I think of them as buckets more so than an actual length, because this could also be a 4-hour presentation. Gradually, very slowly, in-depth detail, going through each of the different points. It's just levels of detail per section. So if you have less time, you have less, you just have less, you have to refine detail. And it's difficult. It's a lot easier to waffle on for 3 hours going through something like this than it is to get it out snappy, quick and fast. But again, the doing this kind of thing in isolation is very, very difficult. I happen to be a paid service that does this, but you don't necessarily have to hire somebody like me to do it. A lot of this you can do with the help of either advisors, peers, of support staff, like at YSpace, like I'm sure Nafis and David and the rest of the staff and the crew at YSpace here have these conversations all the time. Just in discussion about like how we try to simplify this message. But again, that founder blindness and that founder kind of bias towards having to get all the information out there so that somebody understands it is often counteracted by asking somebody else to explain to them what they think the company is about, like how they would understand the company. And what is relevant to them. So to kind of sum that up, the 13 key slides is no indicator of how long it takes to go through it or how much content there is per section. It's really just a matter of how much, what will change that time frame is how much detail you try and get into for each section. And the less detail you get into, the more concise and the more refined the wording is, the better the pitch gets. But you can go too far, to a point where you're using complex terms and really, really super condensed language, sprinting through something very complex to just like hit a time marker. And it's an unfortunate feature of the game we're playing, that just there are certain attention spans that we have, and figuring that out is difficult. If it was easy, I wouldn't have a job. I literally run a company that just does this full time, and I'm swamped. Like, this is literally all we kind of do all day, every day. And so it's a difficult process, but it's not insurmountable. You can get an incredible amount of content across in a short period of time. And the best way to do that, to explain that, is to have a deep understanding of what is important. And you do that by having conversations with other people, describing it to them in a conversational kind of way, understanding all the different segments of the market, getting some experience in explaining it to people and seeing whether it resonates with them or not, adjusting. Like, there is no one punch. much getting everything ready and then going out into the world and getting it sorted. What we do when we work with companies is effectively we role play that interaction just in the course of a couple of sessions and some back and forth on writing. We will role play that understanding. The first part of the process is discovery. So, you know, I tend to sit with a company or sit with a founder and ask them about the company and help me get an understanding of what's going on, so that I can start to synthesize and start to refine with them. And so it's a gradual process. It's a gradual process, and it is something that you should do in collaboration with somebody else. Not because it's impossible to do it on your own. It's just that it isn't necessarily impossible to do it on your own, but the ability to kind of bounce your idea off other people and bounce and kind of throw around ways of explaining things and seeing what resonates. It's different for every company. That's why this is a process and why it's a process and why discovery is so important. But it's an iterative, gradual process. And so refining it down to that really tight 3 minutes, you're going to start at 7. You know, you're going to start at half an hour. You're going to start at 7. You're going to start at 15 minutes, and then gradually, as you explain it to more and more people, and you start to see what resonates with them and what doesn't resonate with them, those points will start to make it higher up in the hierarchy of what you're trying to put in the deck, and ultimately, ideally, you get to a point where you can rattle off a decent explanation about what you're doing, say to a general customer or to an investor, because those may be 2 different messages as well. That you'll get to a point where you can rattle off that explanation of the company in 20 to 30 seconds. But there is no way around getting to that. The only way that you get to that point is having explained it a lot. Like there's no analytical framework that you can employ that does that. It's a psychological problem more than it is a technical or engineering problem. Does that answer your question?
I think that's a really good example, Ben.
Okay, great.
We'll move into the next one. So Todd asks, how should you deal with a question that you don't have an answer to?
Yeah, classic. So often those are, it kind of depends on what the question is and what the venue is. A common one is, say, like a deep technical question, like somebody asks a deep technical question and you don't necessarily, as a CEO, let's say you're the CEO pitching, you don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of the service stack. You don't necessarily have to, or some deep element of the tech. That's why we have discrete roles within companies. Like we have a CTO, because these deep technical things can be so complex and so difficult to understand. And the one tactic to kind of, I'm calling out technical questions because it's just one of the more common ones. I see that inability to respond popping up. The one trick that I've seen is having the CTO in the room as well. If not, you can make sure that you can suggest that you just don't know, and you get back to them. I mean, there is no way, because you either know or you don't know. Right? So the scenarios that can play out there are either you try and tap dance through it and make it up, which is generally probably not a particularly good idea, or you can say, well, you know, I'm not 100% familiar with the service stack. Our CTO would definitely be able to respond to that question. I'm happy to follow up offline if that's an issue. So that is not an ideal situation. Like this, there are no good. There are only bad scenarios because it doesn't answer the question, but you can respond to it respectfully with a way that you can answer it down the line. But what you can do in that scenario is register the question for later, so that if that is a question that has come up, then put it on your list of nightmare questions so that you can check in with your CTO and formulate a response ahead of time. And that applies to all other questions. And so, you know, if depending on what the question is, if you don't know, it's okay to say that you don't know. This is a process of building things out and building out companies. But if something is catching you completely off guard, and is totally out of the blue and is something you don't know about, and it is relevant, and it is a relevant question to the company, then we've just identified a weakness. All right, so you can say, well, not 100% sure about what the answer there is. And again, like, this is not specific wording, it's just general ham-fisted on the fly kind of wording. But you're not 100% sure what. I don't have those numbers at the moment. You can try and refer to something that is close to it, but make sure that whatever you do answer is not trying to divert. Like, don't try and manipulate the scenario and divert it into something else, or change the subject, or try and bring something else up, because they want an answer to that question, and if you don't have it, you just don't have it. There's a couple of tricks you can jump to, like having a CTO in the room, or having some backup slides that might have the answer in it. But if you run into a scenario where that happens, admitting in a polite and kind of constructive way that you don't necessarily have the answer, but happy to follow up with you with when I can get that detail to you. It isn't ideal. But at least it is a response that you can deploy if it's relevant, and if that is a question that is regularly coming, because if it's just a wild card kind of, if it's total wild card and it doesn't come up again, then great. You don't have to use your prepared answer, or your kind of canned response next time, or prepare for that nightmare question. But if it does come up again, and it's a real nasty curveball, and it's a really scary, big ugly question, and you just go, yeah, great. You kind of knew it was coming. You have a prepared statement, or you have a prepared bit of knowledge for it, or you've looked into it to make sure that you can respond to that question, that conversation. Then the next time it comes up, because pitching is not an isolated incident, it's a constant process, and an iterative and ongoing process, that you will be prepared for that question to come up again later. And one of the best ways that you can prepare for those kind of nasty questions is to pitch to a friendly room. And do that regularly, whether that's peers, or whether that's working with somebody like me, or a coach, or support staff at an accelerator, or doing open pitch nights where there isn't really anything on the line. You want to have a decent track record, a decent practice base to move into a room where it really matters that you're able to respond to questions. And ideally, those nasty questions come up in the friendly scenario before they come up in a really heavy scenario. So pitch to your peers, to your advisors, to mentors, to open rooms, so that you can try and uncover what some of those nasty questions are ahead of time. If you do end up in a situation where you don't know, you just got to say that you don't know, because you can't lie. That isn't an option. And you can't divert or change the topic. So it's a matter of, do you admit that you don't know, or do you not admit that you don't know? And one of those is an honest and upfront and constructive answer, and one of those is obfuscating and trying to divert and get out of the scenario. So just meet it head on, and then make sure that it doesn't happen again.
That's awesome. That's excellent. Moving into the next question. So Rohan, who runs a fintech SaaS startup, he's found that when he's communicating his go-to-market plan, he often needs to define or introduce a sub-segment of outlining his second problem statement. So this seems to be confusing in many times when he's talking to investors. What problem should he focus their attention on when describing the go-to-market details?
It depends on the. I mean, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, and Rohan, perhaps if you're in here,
yeah,
if you
have the. For anyone that's asking a question, you're more than welcome to jump off mute and ask me directly as well once the fifth starts.
Sure, that'd be great.
Go ahead.
Thank you for this presentation to start off. I mean, it's great. I've been taking a lot of notes, and it's really useful. But
it'll be $25,000, please. I'm kidding.
Okay. So long story short, it's a fintech that we accelerate deal flow by providing end-to-end marketing and automated underwriting for commercial lenders. So the software itself is great that it solves a problem, but going to market, we're going with one type of lending product and to one industry. So in doing that, we really need to demonstrate, or investors have asked for us to demonstrate, what is the market need for that loan product, and why that industry? And that sort of begs the question as to, okay, now there's actually a second problem statement we need to get into. And where I'm finding is trouble in finding that balance of how many details to put into the pitch versus leaving it for, the follow-up conversation or Q&A. And the challenge is really understanding where should those market details really go, those go-to-market details.
Yeah, I mean, if I just to restate the question, so there are certain industries are trickier than others. Medtech, fintech, deep tech. I do a ton of work in defense as well, like defense and security stuff. They're very, some of these markets are incredibly difficult to explain because they are inherently more complex than others. And so the concern in bringing up more than a single kind of problem statement, and this is something that's sometimes unavoidable, is that you're like diverting attention and going down multiple kind of rabbit holes. So in terms of the initial problem, so if you have two problems, trying to describe them as a single problem may help. And if some of that market detail and some of that go-to-market could be, I mean, what I'm thinking here is whether you add some of that to kind of an overview of what the space is, just to kind of set the stage for what it is that you're doing. And if one of those problems is just an inherent feature of the industry, you can call that out as being, this is, here are some inherent features of the industry. This is what's going on, and this is what's going on, and we solve these with, get into the product. We'll get into what it is you're doing. In terms of like where to add in that go-to-market detail, once you've established what the utility of it is and why the product exists, the go-to-market, please cut in if I'm going off track here, but establishing those initial kind of those two problems as an overview, and then what you're talking about in terms of the go-to-market, that's really your execution. So those are really like two separate sections. So here is the problem that we're solving. Here's how we're solving it.
Right.
I mean, over and above just having them in two discrete sections, if it is crucial that your ability to solve that is a feature of the go-to-market, then it may that chunk of information that is in the go-to-market may really be part of your solution. Because like, your solution isn't necessarily just a bullet point list of what the product is specifically, whether it's a mobile app or a web platform, and describing what the background is. Part of the solution can be a combination of a product that does a thing, right? It doesn't have to be like, here's a product that has these features. No explanation of how it does it.
Do you mind if I just cut in and give a quick follow-up, or just to clarify? So I'm going to just try to put it out there really concisely. So the solution that the problem we're solving for the commercial lenders is the difficulty in finding qualified leads and underwriting them with extreme speed, right? But on the flip side, the secondary problem set is why a specific industry needs that lender's products. And there are hundreds of types of business loans. And the secondary problem is why a business loan is a really good fit for a specific industry. And what we're doing is connecting that industry that is underserved by those business loans with those loans. But that's a secondary problem, right? Because the actual problem.
Right. So are you lending to multiple different industries, or do you have one? Like, is it people that are trying to start auto garages, or is it people that are trying to do transcontinental shipping? Right. Yeah.
In a sentence,
we're starting. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah. In a sentence, it's we're going with accounts receivable financing for the trucking industry. We're going one type of loan with one industry. Right.
Okay. Well, I mean that. So it depends on whether you do really need to like bring those out as two separate problems. Whether you can just bring up the specificity of the issue, because you may be providing too much detail at a high level versus saying like, look, we provide loans to the trucking industry. Why do we do that? Because there's this need.
Right.
Versus we provide loans to companies that want to get into specific sectors. The one we've picked is trucking.
Right.
Like that, that's another approach. But the latter approach is kind of setting a broader stage and then getting into specificity. The other one is going directly into specificity and relying on assumed knowledge. So you're assuming that the audience knows what what the point is ahead of that. Now, in the format of how you described it to me, I'm hearing there's still a little bit of industry jargon, which leads me to believe that the rest of the deck is probably fairly fast and detail heavy. And so you may be depleting your audience's attention due to something like that versus necessarily what the core concepts are that you're describing. Right. So the core concept might be simple, but you may be spending too much time and throwing too much detail at the audience to try and get them to understand it. So maybe it's not necessarily a matter of figuring out, which one of these problems do you state first. Maybe it's a matter of ramping down the detail a little bit and simplifying the message overall, so that you don't deplete the audience's attention. And the tricky thing that you're experiencing with the investors or with whoever you're pitching to, you're starting to identify where that difficulty in comprehension is popping up. So the tactic isn't necessarily to just like focus in on that section and just kind of like hyper optimize it. Maybe you expand it, but you optimize other sections of the deck so that you buy yourself time and space to spend that time on what is so difficult to comprehend.
That's
right. So it's not right. So that's what I'm talking about. Like we have the slide up right now, right? Like you've got a structure. What in your case, if that is the really difficult thing to understand, give it a little bit more space, right? Buy yourself a bit of extra time by refining other sections of the deck, maybe combining other sections of the deck into single slides versus multiple slides, glossing over certain things that may not necessarily be relevant detail. Those small refinements all over the place in the deck that buy you in aggregate enough time to really unpack what is proving so difficult to explain.
That's awesome. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
You're welcome.
2 questions. So John Lee has asked, what is the good response for questions like, what if Google will do this?
Yeah, classic. What if Uber, what if Amazon, what if Google, right?
Exactly.
It depends on the space and it depends on the industry. But in terms of, it kind of depends on, how you respond to that each time depends on what the specific problem is. Generally, generally what tends to happen with these large organizations is that if you are trying to develop a very niche product, these large organizations, just because they're big doesn't mean that they go down every rabbit hole in every niche to go after everything. And so what you can speak to, I'll take an example of Uber, for instance, that there are certain types of transit and certain types of, Uber has a freight vertical, right? It is not one of their major headline verticals because they are a transport company, but they've also not been doing. There's a company that I work with. I don't know whether Eric and Boyd are on the call today, but it's essentially a shuttle service, right? Corporate shuttles for industrial parks and office parks. Uber's run a pilot project doing that, but they shut it down and they're not trying to continue it because they have larger, more important goals. And so how you respond to that is kind of like the vanilla bog standard response is, well, at the moment because you'll have to understand, like, if it's a question that is constantly coming up again, if it's constantly coming up again and again, what you can speak to is, well, that it's a valid question, but at the moment we've not seen any moves on Google's part to do something like to do specifically what we're doing. And because it is so niche, because it is such a niche solution that we're coming up with, it's not necessarily likely that they will try and build that out. Because essentially just because they have bigger problems and they have higher priorities at higher scales. And so Amazon sucks at making phones, but they're amazing at same-day delivery, right? Like they have incredible warehouses, but they make some dog shit phones, right? But that's not it doesn't, just because they're a large organization doesn't mean that they are necessarily the best at everything. Amazon does a ton of things very, very well. Google likewise does a ton of things very, very well, but does not do everything perfectly. And so to respond to that quickly and respectfully, to respond to that kind of quickly and respectfully, it's that if they are a major high-level competitor of yours, genuinely, whether that is Uber, Amazon, Google, Apple, whoever, whatever Facebook, Twitter, whatever the large organization is that you're going up against, knowing what they're, having some indication of what they're working on. If they are working on something that is so close to if they are working on something that is close to your company, there's a fair chance that it's public. I mean, there's obviously tons of secret, proprietary secret programs that go on, but when something is starting to get operationalized and put out into the world, it isn't put out immediately at one massive launch. I mean, the large organizations are accountable to their budgets just as much as startups are, and so if they're going to go off, if they're going to go down a path of specifically going after your company, it's just something that doesn't necessarily happen that frequently. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because it does. Sometimes it does. The what's it called? The flux. The turning your screen a little bit red and like a little bit red and yellow, so that it doesn't. What's it called? The blue light doesn't mess with your eyes. Like, there was a company that did that, and there are apps that did that, but ultimately they integrated that as Android and Apple have, or Google and Apple have integrated that as a feature into their platform, and so the defensibility of the idea the defensibility of the idea itself was difficult, because it's a very general idea. And so if you have a very general idea, if you have a very general kind of basic idea, there's a chance that they will, but at the moment there are no signals indicating that they are. And even if they do, we have done a lot of the fact finding and a lot of the development to date that, I don't know, potentially you could try and position for an acquisition or something like that. Basically, they're saying, like, what if a giant comes and eats your lunch? It's like, well, if they do, they will. So, I mean, it's a difficult question. It definitely is. It is one of the more common and more difficult questions. If this is in a pitch scenario, addressing it up front addressing it up front on your own terms, so that you don't have to answer it in a Q&A format, or it's less likely that you'll have to answer it in a Q&A format, I mean, that's another tactic. So for instance, let's say you do have a parallel product to Uber or to Google that you think there is a genuine chance that they may try and develop a parallel product that outguns you. You need to state the case then early on in the deck and address that concern up front. That they may step into the market. If not, and if you don't address it early on in the deck and kind of neutralize it ahead of time because it isn't that much of a concern, what you can do is create an appendix where you have a slide that does address that should it come up. So I mean, it's common to to a lot of companies, and so there is the kind of ever-present kind of sword of Damocles potential of a large organization like that coming and just eating your lunch. But generally, what we're seeing as the response to it is that there are no, at the moment, we have no reason to believe that they're trying that. And if they do, we're already 6 months to a year ahead of them. And we have deep industry knowledge. We have deep industry knowledge on how to do it, and we're going after this niche. Google has so far not been able to create a particularly good glasses wearable. They've not been able to deploy, what was it called? The internet they did, I think it was in Kansas. They pulled out of that as well. Burn and Lime have spoiled their relationships with municipalities and cities by just carpet bombing cities with tiny, with all these scooters all over the place. And so just because a player is big, it does not necessarily mean that they have, a definite advantage over you, but you do need to understand, if it is a credible threat, you do need to understand what your advantages are over and above those larger players, and be able to call out what your advantages over them are. If there aren't any, you can just fall back. I mean, again, there's no optimal or good or great outcome to it, other than at the moment we've not seen any signals that they are trying to do that. And you can generally tell by, like, who are they hiring, what kind of departments are open, have they opened offices in certain locations, have they opened offices or acquired patents recently that map to what you're doing. If it is a credible threat, you should spend that day or those 2 or 3 days of research to figure that out, so that you can address that question, because it does tend to come up a lot. But in actual fact, it's at such an early stage. If Google wants to do it and come in and eat your lunch, then if they do that, there's not a whole lot you could do about it anyway, because if it turns into a patent fight, they just have bigger guns and they will win. But best you can say is, in that scenario, again, of a non-optimal scenario, is that at the moment there are no signals that they've tried to do that. In the shuttle case with Uber, like, they had tried a pilot project, but they shut it down. So what it looks like is that the company's just taking other priorities first.
That's excellent. And just to get to the final question of the night, and quite fitting for this question to wrap it up, Ben, can you talk about how Pitchwork helps other founders to pitch to investors and partners?
Right. So to maybe, like, elaborate on the question, is that a question around, like, do we connect people with investors, or how do we prepare somebody for that engagement?
Yeah, so Raggy mentioned, I'm just reading it out loud. So how could Pitchwork help founders looking to pitch to investors and partners? Raggy, feel free to unmute your mic and maybe elaborate.
So it's a fairly straightforward answer. Either way, we do not connect people directly with investors. So working with us is not kind of a ticket into some list of investors or getting in front of people. We prepare people for the engagements that they're going into. Because I do not have an investment broker's license, it's not viable for us as a company to try and connect people with investors. Yeah, Raggy, are you there?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out the mute. No, I was asking what kind of support do you provide to founders trying to pitch in general? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So in terms of, like, what that service looks like is that it's such kind of a 4-step process of going through discovery, story design, and delivery, and that is a kind of a one-on-one. On the surface, it looks a lot like a freelance engagement, but it is a productized service that we've obviously, like, optimized and worked on over a long period of time. So essentially, they're one-on-one sessions with myself, kind of sitting down, actually figuring out what the company's all about, understanding what some of the weak points and what some of the advantages of the company are. Because often we'll start picking apart a company and start spotting strengths and weaknesses that the founder was previously unaware of, or had kind of put, like, mental blinders on and had kind of stuffed away in a corner and not wanted to deal with. So we uncover all of those things from the perspective of both examining the deck from kind of an investor's perspective, but also trying to communicate from the founder's perspective. We do so in a friendly environment. So a lot of that, we spend a decent amount of time on just getting to understand the company one-on-one. We do that remotely, we used to do it in person with DMZ companies or YSpace companies on site as a kind of a 1 to 2 hour sit down per company. And depending on how much help and kind of how much resources the company's willing to put in, the further down the line in terms of the process that we get. So just doing discovery and and figuring out what exactly is going on with the company, that's essentially kind of an interview format and a conversation based on, you know, a lot of my own knowledge of different industries and tech ecosystems and just what this game is that we're playing. To follow on from that, obviously we'll take a lot of that discovery and write out a new story, a new script. Take that script and turn it into a deck, and then train the founder on actually presenting that deck through either again, like remote kind of one-on-one sessions. So it is very hands-on. We're not doing, you know, there's no these kind of workshops, for instance, is something that we do generally for kind of idea stage companies or larger groups to companies, but the vast majority is a hands-on kind of one-on-one engagement. It is something that we're trying to figure out how to scale at the moment, because we're able to provide, you know, a ton of value when we do sit down with companies one-on-one. But as has become displayed over the past 2 months very acutely, and over the past year as well, is that we've yet to figure out kind of what a scalable model of that looks like. But to answer your question, it is essentially a one-on-one service that goes from analysis to writing to production to coaching.
Beautiful. I think you know, that brings us kind of to the finish line for your marathon today, and it certainly felt like you were sprinting right through the marathon for nearly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, it's a deep topic, and there's a lot to discuss. And if anybody has kind of specific questions, you know, feel free to send me an email. I will try and get back to you as soon as possible. I'll get back to everybody. I will get back to everybody eventually, but it may take a day or two if I get a big influx of questions. But I'll do my best to respond if anybody wants to connect after the fact.
That's incredible, and Ben, we are very appreciative of you being so gracious with your time with our group today. This has certainly been incredibly insightful for us all. The engagement was proof showing that. We are all, you know, we have a lot to take away from today's session, and we just want to thank you for leading this with us today.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Nafis, and thanks everyone for taking the time to listen in. And I wish you all luck on your journey. And I'm around in the ecosystem. And you know, please do reach out if you have any questions. And I hope to see as many of you as soon as I can.